disc. This episode started from the question, where do these patterns come from? The patterns of my behavior. And how can I change this pattern? A pattern that I keep repeating in my relationships is the story of me being unwanted, abandoned by my partner. The set and the characters may change, but I keep casting them and myself in the same roles. This urges me to try to uncover the source. What is the root of this strange plant that grows its flowers of abandonment wounds again and again in different relationships with different people, no matter how many times I tear the plant up from the ground? I have to find the real root, the deepest root, or it will just keep growing back. Maybe I can't find the very, very deepest root, but I can dig a bit deeper than what I was able to see before, at least. Depending on the type of wound, we may be more or less conscious about where it came from, about the source or the root. For me, I often receive hints through visuals that I see appearing in my mind, connected to certain behavior, or when I'm thinking about it, trying to understand a certain event or behavior, like if I went into a flight or fight response with my partner. So, as I was contemplating my tendency to produce or project the feeling of being unwanted in my relationships, I kept seeing the same visual popping up in my mind. Me when I was 13-year-old, almost 14, at the end of my first year in junior high, attending lessons with a teacher that I was in love with. I saw this visual of that year, that first year when I had lessons with this teacher or classes, and this visual somehow came up in situations where I experienced this abandonment or unwanted in partnerships, and this hint opened a door to memories that I have been suppressing until now, my whole life, or forgotten. They've been in the subconscious, but haven't consciously been aware of it, but I've been acting it out in my life. And it's strange to go back to this now, because it is not a very dramatic story, because nothing really happened between me and that teacher. And often when you think of traumatic events or something that's creating a root or a source for these kinds of abandonment wounds, you think of something really concrete, explicit that happened. And here I tried to understand what was it that created this wound, since nothing really happened between us. It was totally one-sided, and even though my emotions were strong, I was completely aware that this was more like a practice ground for feeling love than a shared connection. I simply needed to feel and practice feeling. And even at that age, I knew that. And I had read about it in some psychology books that this is a normal stage of development where teenagers fall in love with some kind of an idol. If it's a musician or an artist or a teacher. So from my side, I didn't have expectations for anything from the person, from that teacher. Though nothing really happened, I have to acknowledge my feeling that there were strange things happening below the surface that somehow resulted in me developing this deep wound of feeling unwanted. Even though nothing would be seen in the outer reality, it doesn't mean that nothing is going on underneath, in the subconscious, in the depths. And that is what this podcast is for, after all. For going into those depths. And now, in this episode, I want to go deeper into that and explore what that was. May it serve as an example of this process of trying to uncover or understand a route to these kinds of destructive patterns. Before I share my memories of these events, I want to point out that I don't think the adults who were a part of it could have acted much better than they did. And I think they were trying to be understanding in the way that they were able to. It is simply unfortunate how things sometimes happen and how wounds can be created, even from the best of intentions. I also want to point out the different stages that teenagers and adults are at, and how it affects their approach and their view of things, and how their experience feels. I was 13, almost 14 at that time, and I felt extremely vulnerable. I remember life felt so huge and scary and unknown, and so did these new emotions that were raging up from inside of me, and I was surprised and a bit scared by the intensity. Yet I had no choice but to feel them, to go through it. No matter how much I wanted to suppress them with my rational mind, I had to surrender and accept that I had to feel it. And that's how I treated this passion I felt for a teacher. Just, I have to go through this stage to feel this, and then hopefully it will pass. So I was quite conscious about that, but I was still in very intense emotions and very sensitive. And the adults were in a very different place. I don't think they anymore had a way to access that kind of a raw emotion that a teenager was in. And they saw the events from their mature and sensible point of view. And that is probably exactly what was right for them to do. But between us there was a clash, where I was left with the feeling that I was being overlooked, that my emotional reality was denied any right to exist, that it was wrong. And the pain that resulted from this feeling of being and feeling so very wrong, that the feelings I felt were wrong, grew in power, fueled by my intensely sensitive and vulnerable state. That's just what happened. So, let's get on with the story so you actually know the experience of it, what it was that was fueling these emotions. The teacher that I was in love with was handsome and always dressed smartly. They felt very clean and polished somehow. I can't quite remember their face anymore, but I remember their energy. They seemed to have an aura of calm confidence. I have often felt a bit mature for my age, while at the same time also being very immature, or maybe I should say, inhabiting a childlike wonder. But when I saw this teacher when I was 13 years old, it was clear that none of my classmates, no one my age could compete. I just admired the teacher and over time accepted that I was in love with them. Because they inhabited something that I was looking for and hoping to develop in myself, this kind of adult, calm confidence. And I was feeling so awkward and conscious, self-conscious at that age. But even then I understood that nothing would come of it, and in fact I preferred it that way. So I tried to keep cool during lessons, to be in the last row, to sit in the back and hope that the teacher wouldn't notice the passion raging within me. But of course they did notice somehow. I guess that such a fire will always have some flames escaping out, and such energy, even suppressed, even when attempting to hide it, can be felt. Towards the end of my first year in high school, there was a parent-teacher conference. Not with that teacher that I was in love with, but the woman who was the administrator of my group. At first, the meeting went on in the usual way. She spoke with my mom about my grades, what went well and where I could improve. But towards the end of the meeting, something strange happened. She suddenly said that Minna-Mari is very mature for her age. That there was a teacher that had noticed a look in my eye. That's what she said. And that for the next years, Minna-Mari will no longer take part in that particular teacher's class. She will attend another teacher who teaches the same subject instead. She said, it will be better this way. Everyone will be more comfortable that way. And all of this, she was calmly and smilingly saying to my mother, who nodded and smiled back, while only giving me quick glances in between. My mother was the one receiving her words, the adult, the person in the room. In the end, both of them turned to me and smiled, trying to show their most understanding faces. I felt paralyzed. I was in shock. I had not spoken during the entire meeting. I was simply the object that these two adult women were discussing about amongst themselves. I just happened to be there to witness their exchange, their judgments and verdicts on my efforts and developments, and now my awkwardness unsuitable emotions. All I could feel was the nausea, the disgust building inside of me, the discomfort of having been found out of my deep passion and fire, so casually mentioned and then quickly pushed to the side, with a lid oh so gently placed over my burning heart, suffocating it. The teacher knew about my feelings. They knew, and it made them so uncomfortable, maybe even disgusted, that they didn't want to teach me anymore. They discarded me and handed me to another teacher instead. I felt utterly unwanted, abandoned, and disgusting. I felt that if I had made a grown person so afraid of my love, there must be something very wrong with me. Something that was so disgusting and awful that it warranted abandonment without further explanations, without even daring to talk to me in person. And the teacher who shared the news wasn't even addressing me either, but my mother. I felt like I was nothing. Just a ghost, floating silently in the background while they were sealing my fate. It's not that I even minded being in another class from the teacher I was in love with. Actually, that was a huge relief, because I knew I had to get over them and these emotions. And it was easier when not sharing classes. But it still wasn't easy. For many years afterwards, that teacher's face would suddenly pop up in my head, and with it a gut-wrenching, nauseating self-disgust. I was disgusting for making them feel so uncomfortable. My love for them was unacceptable. It was wrong. It was disgusting. It shouldn't exist. No wonder they didn't want me. No wonder they discarded me. Only now, 20 years later, have I started to realize that was a traumatic event. For years, I had flashbacks about that disgust that I projected from them at myself. Only now can I finally look into it, trying to understand what actually happened and what conclusions I subconsciously drew from it, and how it has affected all of my subsequent relationships. No wonder I keep repeating the same pattern in my later relationships. That was my first blueprint of how my love was received. The strongest love I had felt up until that point was received as a burden, as something unwanted, as something disgusting and horrible, as something to suppress and silence and cast aside. as I contemplate this event now, I realize that what further fueled my feeling of being unwanted was that whole situation of the parent-teacher conference, where I experienced myself as being overlooked, where there wasn't any space for me to be heard or understood. There wasn't any space for just processing my emotions. Or I think that the teacher who spoke with my mother tried to make it appear neutral and play it down as nothing to worry about. I think that was the intention, and I can see it now and understand it. But sadly, in that situation, what it created for me was the feeling that the huge clash between an experience that was important for me and then feeling that it wasn't allowed to be as important or as big, that there was actually no space, no allowance to just feel what I felt. Of course, there's a difference between feeling something and then expressing. But what that situation created for me was the feeling that I didn't even have a right to feel what I felt, because even with me trying to hide it, it had still made someone so uncomfortable that they didn't want me anywhere close. And I'm thinking back on that situation, and could there have been some other way of handling it that would have helped or not created this kind of a reaction in me? That maybe if there had been some clarification that this is normal, it happens, and it's nothing to worry about, and you're allowed to feel what you feel, but maybe it's easier to just keep some distance. And this is a tricky thing, because I believe that teacher was doing their best, and they were also trying to do that. She was trying to say that I was mature for my age, was her way of trying to express that. But what I heard in that sensitive state was that I was wrong, that I was something I wasn't supposed to be, and that I felt something that I wasn't supposed to feel. And with my mother and that teacher, there was like, I carried this wound all these years, and there was like no possibility that I would bring it up or talk about it, because in that situation, there was no one who asked me to bring anything up, or I had the feeling of that, okay, now we have to close the lid on this and move on. And I was so unable to ask for help or ask for clarification or just an adult who would help me process what actually had happened or my emotions about it, that I felt I was completely alone to draw the worst conclusions. That's what I did. And no one really meant to hurt anyone. And I don't even think that the teacher or my mother were at all aware of this wound that just was created in me from this. Maybe because they weren't in a place where they could feel that kind of a sensitivity. So that didn't exist in their reality. I can understand that. But that made it feel for me like it was not allowed to exist in mine either. And I tried to suppress it for many years. And now I can look at it and say that my emotions were allowed to exist. And my reality was my reality. And their reality was theirs. And they're both existing. And they're both just as right. We just had different experiences. For many years, I think I also suppressed this because in that situation, it was all presented as something so easy breezy that, oh, she's so mature, she's such a mature girl for her age, she will understand it, she's very rational. And of course I did, but that left no space for me to also just feel what I felt. Like, oh, we don't need to go deeper into this with her because she understands. And yeah, I tried to take on that approach and just no, I don't need to process this pain. I understand with my mind. And that's why I pushed it down. And that's why my emotions or my subconscious pushed it back up again in my later relationships. I am repeating this pattern of experiencing others receiving me that way because that wound is still alive in me. Because that wound needs me to see it, to look at it, to heal it. Instead of just suppressing it and trying to look away. My heart can't really love if it is hidden, suffocated underneath a heavy lid. I can now see how this pattern has repeated in many relationships in different ways. Sometimes I played the role of the person who rejects the other. I felt the need to assert my right to reject, either from a sense of needing to feel the other side, what I felt was done to me, so that I could understand it or feel empowered by being in that position myself. But most times I have played the same old role of feeling unwanted and rejected by my loved one. Because that was simply how I still felt deep inside. That was what I expected. That was still inside of me, so that was the role that I projected for myself in the relationship. And in so doing, I cast my partner as the rejecting character who was disgusted by my emotions. But in reality, I was the one being disgusted with myself. I just needed to use them as a mirror. I needed to create situations where they would enact that way towards me, where they would enact that, so that I could feel it again and again, so that it would be expressed out, instead of just bubbling in the subconscious as it did back then. I needed to make those feelings real and concrete, so that I could process them and finally see what was going on. My heart goes out to those who knew me during these years, during this process, who knew me intimately enough to experience that. I don't know if any of those people are listening to this, but I will send you a thank you. and I'm sorry into the void. Thank you. I'm sorry. Maybe your own healing process also coincided with mine. Maybe I also had a role to play in your own story. Regardless of which, I wish you well. I wish you have found love in yourself, in your own life, in your own way. And now I am lifting the lid that I felt was being put over my heart so many years ago. My love deserves to exist. I did not actually do anything wrong. I was just feeling what I felt, even if my love chose an unsuitable target. And I know that my intention was never to burden them. And I know the adults tried to do their best too. But even then, I have a right to feel hurt by the events. Both can be true. I have a right to feel the pain I need to feel, to acknowledge the wound, to go deep to the root. And I can also acknowledge that they were probably doing their best too. And they did well. Because by now I know that adults get scared too. I can understand if my love would scare someone. Because I know it runs deep. It runs deep and it burns with a vengeance. And it already did back then. I can understand that even an adult would get scared. Because I'm an adult now. And I also get scared. And I also try my best, and maybe wounds will still be created, despite my best intentions. This is the root, or at least a root to the issue, to my feeling of being unwanted. And now I see it is not a root to be violently torn up. It is a root to be tended, because the plant that grows from this root can grow into different shapes. Now that I acknowledge the root, I can finally give it what it needs. Acceptance, appreciation, care, and love. Accepting the depth of my emotions. Appreciating the passion that this depth brings. Caring for myself. No longer unwanted. Because I want to be with and care for myself. And holding a love that burns patiently with power, because that's just what it does. My love is radiating out from my being, but it is also radiating into myself. That is what it was made to do, what I was made to do. I lift the lid away from my heart, I release all that self-disgust and fear that I used to aim at myself and at others. The fear of being abandoned and unwanted. No one can abandon me anymore because I stopped abandoning myself. I am no longer unwanted because I want to know, to love, and to care for myself. And when I can do that, I can love others too.